Hey everybody, Jason here. Before we get started, just want to give a quick PSA that this episode is a bit long. Longer than we're used to here at Every Night is Game Night. We try to keep episodes under an hour. This one is clocking in at about an hour and a half. As you'll hear, I think the conversation really lent itself to a little bit of breathing room. I couldn't find a spot to cut it, so I'm just going to give it to you, the whole thing in one shot. So maybe I'll make it up at some point by having a super short episode. We'll see. But I hope you enjoy. On to the show.
Welcome to Every Night is Game Night, your home for heavy strategy, awesome theme, and everything in between. Check us out along with other great podcasts at dicetowernetwork.com.
Every Night is Game Night, episode 134, Podcaster Roundtable on Thematic Games. Yo, my peoples, what's up? Welcome back to the Every Night is Game Night podcast. I'm your host, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have a podcast for you today that was a bear to schedule, but thank goodness we finally got ourselves together. I am so excited. I have a couple of gentlemen here who are here to talk about theme in games. We had a conversation on Twitter which blossomed into this podcast. Hopefully this will be entertaining for you guys. I am very excited to introduce first Mr. Paul Grogan of the Gaming Rules Gaming Empire. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you for having me on.
All right. We also have a returning guest. You have heard his voice on our podcast before. He is Marc Davis of the Thoughtful Gamer Gaming Empire. Welcome to the show, Marc.
Thanks for having me. This will be fun.
All right, we are here to talk about theme. Like I said before, we on Twitter, we responded, I think it was in particular to a Dice Tower video that was talking about theme. We will get into all that, don't you worry. A little bit of a funny conversation. But before we get into that, just in case our audience is not familiar, maybe, Paul, we'll start with you. Maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Paul Grogan. As you'll probably guess from the accent, I'm not from America. I'm all the way over in the UK. And I run the YouTube channel and everything else, Gaming Rules, where I create instructional videos on how to play games. I also write and edit rule books for a living. I do game development, not so much game design, but definitely game development. I work for various publishers doing demos at conventions. But also, apart from the professional side of things, I'm also a game reviewer. So on my YouTube channel, I also do my own podcast. I do reviews and everything else. So there's pretty much, there's nothing that I don't do, really. So yeah, I do a bit of everything.
And you, Marc, Thoughtful Gamer is a podcast and
I review games. I write articles talking about different aspects of game design or the gaming community. Basically whatever's on my mind at the moment, but focusing on reviews from a thoughtful perspective, as the name implies.
It's interesting what you said at the start, how this, I mean, yeah, we've been trying to, schedule, however you want to pronounce it, this podcast for a while, because of course with me being over in the UK and obviously families and things like that, we first talked about this, a couple of months ago now?
It's like 6 weeks ago or something, yeah.
Yeah, and it is interesting because obviously Dice Tower is massively popular, they've got a huge following. They say anything at all that's slightly controversial and suddenly the internet explodes with people like, oh, they're talking absolute rubbish. And, like any big content creator, they get their hordes of people who say they're all, stupid and they don't know what they're talking about. And you get other hordes of people completely agreeing with them. But what it has done is it's led to this podcast, because it was an interesting discussion we were having on Twitter, and you were like, hang on a minute, Twitter's not the right place for this discussion. Let's do a podcast about it.
Yeah, the little tiny characters and everything, and you have to kind of click 4 links in order to follow the conversation. Get out of here. Just one link, this podcast. We're going to have you hooked up on theme. And it's funny because you mentioned the Dice Tower. In particular, it's Sam Healy that people get really mad at.
Yep. Poor Sam.
Poor Sam. He gets a lot of vitriol. We're going to get into exactly kind of the Dice Tower context and how that all introduced just in a bit. But since we're talking about thematic games, I kind of wanted to just start with a basic definition, what you guys think of theme, because I think we all define it a little bit differently. and I'd like to do what I can to make sure we're on the same page before we do that. I've been picking on Paul a little while. Mark, go ahead and go first. Let's see how do you approach the question of what is a thematic game and what is a theme in a game?
The way I always look at it is that a game is thematic when the theme of the game, the setting of the game, or the kind of agency of the players within the narrative of that game match up with the mechanisms. So in other words, are the game mechanisms presented in such a way that you are making the same kind of decisions that your character in the game would be presented with within the story of the game?
Mm-hmm. So, like, if you're... Well, give an example to make that a little bit real.
I mean, I've said before that I think Twilight Struggle is the most thematic game that I've played, at least. Even though it wouldn't necessarily fit kind of common ideas of thematicness, because it's a game set in the Cold War, and it has a number of ways in which it pushes players through just the design of the game into thinking like a leader in the USSR or the US would have thought during the Cold War. It pushes players towards the brink of nuclear war without actually going over that edge. It pushes players to think about countries in terms of how much they can influence those countries and kind of create a chain of influence geographically. It pushes players into paranoia because of the way it deals with the deck of cards. It has a whole bunch of different ways in which it makes players think like their characters in the game would have thought. And that's really what a thematic game feels like to me.
And it does so through mechanism, which I know, Paul, I think that's a core part of your definition, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting what Mark said about Twilight Struggle, because whilst I what you said is that you said, you might be surprised to hear that you feel that this is a thematic game. And when you said Twilight Struggle, I was like, what, really? And then as you explained it, I was like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, actually, you're right. So, yeah, I think it's not going to appear on people's list of, top 10 thematic games. But when you actually think about it, it is interesting. One thing, though, with Twilight Struggle is it's representing a historical event. So it's representing, something that actually happened. And my definition of a thematic game is kind of taking that, but extending it further to basically any game. It doesn't have to be a historical representation of something that happened. It could be absolutely anything, but it's one where the game mechanisms actually fit with the setting of the game. Mm-hmm. So if I give you an example of a game which I believe is completely not thematic in any way at all, which is Castles of Burgundy, which is one of my favorite. Stefan Feld is one of my favorite designers. I love pretty much every single Stefan Feld game, so I'm saying this from a fan's point of view, but Castles of Burgundy, like pretty much all of his games, have no actual theme in them. So the setting of the game, and we'll come on to my difference later on, but the setting of the game is, well, I don't actually know, but it's kind of medievally, and you're kind of building stuff, but if that was real life, as the lord of the manor deciding what buildings get built, do I roll 2d6 and then do I take tiles from a display and then do I roll another d6 to see where I put them on my board, and do I get points for making sets that fit in it? No. That's completely not a thematic game whatsoever. Whereas a thematic game, and rather than quoting one, I'm just going to make one up. Let's say in this game, the mechanisms are, you are a person and you have 12 working hours in the day, and you decide what to do with those hours. And if you spend 3 hours chopping down trees in the forest, you'll get 4 wood, but then you've got to spend 1 hour bringing that wood home. If you don't spend the hour bringing it home, you could pay somebody to bring it home for you, and that frees your own time up to do something else. Suddenly, the mechanisms in the game, you go, yeah, that makes sense. I don't have the time to bring that wood from the forest, so I'm going to pay Alan, who's got a van, and I'm going to give him money and he's going to bring that wood. And obviously in the game, what you're saying is you can spend 1 time unit to move 3 cubes from A to B, or you can spend $5 to pay Alan to move cubes from A to B. That's the game mechanics, but suddenly you can relate those game mechanics to, oh yeah, that fits, that makes absolute sense. So yeah, that's kind of my definition, is where the mechanisms in the game fit either the setting or, people can easily imagine it because they fit what reality would be.
That sounds like a very fiddly game there, Mark.
Wait, mine? Twilight Struggle?
No, sorry. Paul.
Well, it's moving 3 wooden cubes from A to B. I mean, it's every Euro game.
I guess, like,
Unless you pay Alan.
Like an unthematic game, and I think we'll get to this when we talk about Euros, which is kind of down the road, but I think an unthematic game would try to do the streamline thing. So, like, I got to get wood from A to B. I'm just going to tell you, here, you bring wood to A to B. To bring theme, you have to bring in, okay, I have to pay Alan, and I have to do this, and you have to kind of introduce mechanisms in order to kind of bring theme out. So I guess that'd be a good counterpoint of what's a thematic game versus not so much,
Yeah, I mean, obviously, another reason for a non-thematic game is an abstract game.
Right.
So Reiner Knizitz's Ingenious or Genial or whatever is one of my favourite abstract games. I absolutely love it. It's an abstract game, so there is no theme in it. You're just placing tiles on the board, and you're trying to match colours, and if you match the colours, you get points. Ganshon Clever, recent games like that, there's no theme in that whatsoever, and there doesn't need to be a theme.
Right.
It's when you try to paste a theme onto a game, but actually the mechanisms are, so detached from what the theme is that you think, oh, okay, yeah, this is really not theme. In my opinion, that's my definition of theme anyway.
Okay. I agree with you guys. I think I want to take it one step further because I think when it talks about theme and mechanisms, I think there is a user experience part of it. So, like, when you talked about Twilight Struggle, Mark, and then Paul said, what? I think there is the person has to be there in the definition because one person's thematic game is another person's card playing dice chucker or whatever it is. So it has to be a sense in which, so I think of theme as the underlying imaginative world that provides context and meanings to player actions. And then a thematic game is a game that tries to make that link. And the key word being try, in the sense that, like, there's some games that don't care, and that's fine. Like you were saying before, Ganshon Clever and everything. But some games really try. Some games they have, through their mechanisms of evoking that imaginative response. So then if a game does evoke that imaginative response, that's great. But even if it doesn't, at least it's kind of like grabbing at me. Like it's barking at me. It's okay. Immerse me in the world. You are Churchill. You are, Teddy Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt. Fighting wars and stuff like that. You are these people that are trying to make these big witty decisions. Or in your game, you're building a castle and everything, and I am that builder, so to speak. And it's trying to get a game might not be successful for me, but at least it's trying. Right. So I mean, I guess I would kind of make sure that user part of it is would be part of that definition. What do you think of that, Mark?
I'm wondering if there could be, like, if we could kind of merge these definitions into tiers, right? Because the type of thematicness that I'm describing is kind of like, if you're trying to make a thematic experience, it's the point you really want to reach, but it's not necessarily all that theme is. So in other words, if you're transporting the players into the kind of headspace or into the kind of decision making that their characters in the game would be thinking about and making, that's kind of the ultimate thematicness, I guess, or that's kind of the pinnacle of it. But I think you have something when a game simply tries to make a connection between theme, or you could even put it to 3 tiers, right? If a game is really trying to present a setting very evocatively, that's kind of the lowest tier. Okay, it's trying to communicate something about the setting, but it doesn't actually interact with the players a lot. If the theme is trying to interact with the players somewhat, or at least present something that connects the setting to the mechanisms, that could be kind of a second tier. And then the third tier being the players are actually in the headspace of their characters. I wonder if that's kind of an interesting way to think about it.
So, like, you can make space for, like, a game being thematic, which is your highest level, but then a game has thematic elements, say.
Sure.
So, like, a game like Psy, it has a world, and it's been drawn out by this guy, Jacob Rizalski or something, and it's wonderful to kind of be in that world, but I wouldn't call Psy the thematic game. I'm not in the headspace of the Roosevelt clan or whatever it is. So.
I think that's a perfect example, right? It presents a very interesting world, and you can imagine that world, and maybe you can get into it a bit while playing the game, but very few of the decisions that you're making in Scythe actually correspond to that theme, or actually feel like you're part of that world. As soon as you make a decision in the game, you're kind of thrown out again.
Yeah, saying that though, if we just interrupt, I'm not world's biggest fan of Scythe, but going back to what you said about a game could have some thematic elements, and there are a few rules within Scythe which are very thematic. So if you move one of your mechs into another player's hex where they don't have mechs, but they do have, farmers, the farmers run away and you lose popularity.
Yeah.
That is a perfect example of a thematic rule in a game.
So then I want to, this is a great point, a great pivot point to what you were talking about, the distinction between theme and setting, Paul. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is not my original definition. It's somebody else's, which I've stolen from them and basically stamped my own stamp on it.
Are you going to identify this, I
can't remember who it was. So I'm going to say either Dukes of Dice or Brawling Brothers.
Okay.
And it may not have been either of those, because it was over 3 years ago, and I heard it on one of their podcasts or something, and I went, wow, I agree with that 100%. I take it, and I've been regurgitating it. So many people now think that it's Paul's definition of setting versus theme, and it's not. It was actually somebody else's. So almost every game that isn't an abstract game has a setting. And if we go back to Castles of Burgundy, my example of a game with no theme, it has a setting. You are building up this, this land of castles and cities and farms, and and almost every game that I play, apart from the abstracts, has a setting. But the theme, as I mentioned earlier on, is the mechanical integration to the setting. So Concordia, classic Euro game, trading in the Mediterranean. Of course, it has a setting. You are merchants and you're wandering around and you're setting up offices or doing whatever you're doing. And there are no real thematic mechanisms within the game, but it's not a complete abstract because it has a setting. So that's, generally on the scale, the Euro games tend to have a setting, but most of them, although they might have some thematic rules in there, like the one we mentioned with Scythe, the theme of the game, there's not generally much theme there within Euro games. It's more centered around the mechanisms, even if some of those mechanisms do have, some thematic connection.
Right. So when we talk about a game having a pasted on theme, which is exactly the conversation that the Dice Tower was having. So the top list was like, top 10 themeless games. What they really meant was games with pasted on themes, which is a game that can have, like in their definition, a game that can have any theme. Z Garcia said, could this game be about goats? It could, therefore it's a themeless game. So what I think they really mean is a game that can have any setting. And theme
by my
is
definition,
different.
Yes. But as I say, I'm involved in conversations at least once every 2 weeks on various Facebook groups about what is a thematic game. This is a discussion that's been going on for years and will still go on. And most people will say that the theme of the game of Castles of Burgundy is that you're building up this land. And I'm like, no, that's not theme, that's setting. So, as again, this is my definition of theme versus setting. But most people's definition of theme is what I would class as the setting. And this is where people end up arguing just because they're using their own different definitions of the same term. Basically, what I'm saying is if everybody gets on the same page as me with the terms in the whole world, then we can stop all the arguing and we can actually have discussions about it.
Let's get on the same page as Paul right now.
Basically. What they said about, the fact that you can replace this entire theme or setting in the game with goats and it would still be the same game, I absolutely agree with that. And I use space dinosaurs as the joke. So I've used this phrase a number of times, and a lot of the reviews that I've done in the last 3 or 4 months, which have been really positive reviews, like Newton was my last game that I reviewed, and I said this is one of the best games of 2018. I absolutely loved it. The setting of the game is that you are, great scientists and you're traveling around Europe and you've got students doing research and you're inventing things. No, right? You're moving bits around a board and you're unlocking bonus tiles that give you other bits, but there's no theme in the game whatsoever. There is no thematic connection. You're not doing research. You're not inventing things. The invention tile is just a tile with icons on, which gives you stuff. What does this invention do? Oh, it gives you an extra one of those pieces, 5 money and a cube. Right. That's not theme. The fact that you've called the tile an invention tile is irrelevant. And as I say, I've used the phrase before that you could take the entire game of Newton and strip it away and make it about something completely different, and it would be exactly the same game.
Right.
And that is where a theme, I think, is pasted on, is where you can just completely change it from one thing to another, and it would still be exactly the same game. Now, of course, you might have to, some people will argue against that and say, well, hang on a minute, in Newton, you're doing scientific research, and if you build up cards with the same icons, then that's good, and that shows that you're doing more research in a particular... No, you just need to rebrand it as something else, but you could transplant the entire game to another setting, and it would work absolutely fine.
Right. Like, the way I think of it, and the pithy way I've kind of come up with saying is like, setting is a noun, but theme is a verb. In the sense of like, because we all talked about theme being integrated with mechanisms, like mechanisms are what deliver theme. Mechanisms are what evoke theme. So then if a setting of a game is a, French medieval landscape, the theme of the game is building. If we're playing viticulture, the setting of the game is a vineyard. The theme of the game is winemaking. So, like, are you doing the thing that, go to Paul's thing about, headspace? Like, if you're in that world as a farmer or a winemaker or a builder, am I doing the things that a person in that setting would do? If the answer is I'm pushing a cube from A to B, then no. But if I'm making a decision where it's like, okay, I have to wait 3 hours and, for the thing to ripen and spend your time units and all that kind of stuff, then I'm starting to, like, the game is giving me enough where I can get into that headspace and make a decision as the person in that game, which is Marc's highest definition of theme. So in the sense of like, if you can't talk about a game, if you can't talk about a theme as like a verb, then I think you're doing it wrong. So Paul, you have actually, it was your setting versus theme thing that kind of helped me place that. It's like, yes. And the thing about Sam, where people really got mad at Sam was he called Time Stories a themeless game. And
this is an interesting conversation.
Right. Can I throw in a couple thoughts before we get into that?
Yeah, go ahead. Before we get to it, go ahead, Marc.
Just a couple things that came to mind. I think we ought to be a bit careful about this idea of a pasted-on theme, because I think certain game mechanisms just lend themselves to cross-applying to a lot of different settings. For instance, I'm thinking of anything with conflict, right? You could take any game with conflict and kind of cross-apply it to a number of different settings, right? It could be a science fiction conflict. It could be a historical conflict. It could be fantasy conflict, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not thematic, just because its particular rule set can be cross-applied to a number of different other things that are similar, but in some ways, but vastly different in others. Push Your Luck is another one that comes to mind, right? There are a ton of real life examples or common game setting examples where Push Your Luck is a very thematic aspect of that game, but they could be completely different settings. So I think the cross applicability of it doesn't necessarily make it not thematic. I think it's interesting, Jason, when you're talking about something like viticulture, where what are you doing in the game? Are you making wine? Well, the answer to that is that no, you're never making wine. You're always doing some combination of like card playing and pushing cubes around, which is why I always think it's more interesting to think about it in terms of the decision-making process. What are the decisions you're making in the game? And in viticulture, a lot of the time is you're choosing between short-term and long-term rewards. So you're deciding between, do I cash in for something right now, or do I make some kind of investment in order to reap a higher payout later on? And that's fairly thematic to the setting of winemaking, right? That's the decision space that makes viticulture maybe a bit more thematic than other Euros, not necessarily that the particular cube pushing you're doing is representative of winemaking, because that can be said of anything. The particular, tile laying in Castles of Burgundy, you're laying down some animal tiles. They look like animals. Sure, you could say I'm building a farm, right? But that doesn't actually mean anything. The decision space in Castles of Burgundy isn't representative of estate building at all. The decision space in viticulture is kind of representative of the kind of decisions that people who own vineyards would be making. So I think that distinction ought to be said.
Yeah, and I think so viticulture is a kind of thematic game.
Yeah, I think it does a decent job. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. As much as a Euro does, and we'll get to again. I know I'm putting off some things, but there's certain limitations that Euros have. But as much as Scythe and viticulture were going on the Stegmaier thing, because I think he does take theme seriously a little bit more than some other designers. Even a game like the Gallerist, the Gallerist, I wouldn't say is an amazingly thematic game, but there's certain parts of it. The way that art pieces circulate and everything, and prices going up and down. I can kind of get into that more than some of his other games. And what you were saying before about the cross purposes, if you can put a bunch of settings on a mechanism, but it's still kind of the same thing, then that's exactly a thematic game. I'm so glad you said that, because that's exactly what Time Stories is. The theme of Time Stories is not zombies or what else are you doing, like Asylum or whatever it is. The theme is exploration in those worlds. So that set of mechanisms can be cross-purposed to a bunch of settings, but the way it plays out with the deck exploration and the dice rolling, that's intentionally, it evokes theme. So if you can say that a game is settingless, fine, but they've managed to find a system of mechanisms that works within an exploration adventure space and case solving and all that stuff. That's all thematic stuff. So that I would consider that's, we're going to talk about our favorite thematic games. That's right up there for me,
Okay. It's interesting because, Time Stories is a narrative-driven game. It has story in it, and obviously games with narrative, people will be more attached to the setting of it because they'll feel like they're more in that place because you're reading all of this stuff about the people that are there and descriptions of the places that you're going and everything else. And Time Stories, I love playing Time Stories. So it's a game, again, which I'm another fan of. But then one of my friends played Time Stories and absolutely hated it. And I was like, well, why are you hating it? Because we really like it. And he said, there's no theme in this game whatsoever. And he explained it to me. And I'm like, oh, I see. So you could take the Time Stories mechanism, okay, and you could strip off most of the artwork or all of the artwork and almost all of the text and just say, right, you've gone to this card, now turn over that card. Oh, you've gone to this card, take item number 17. And item number 17 is literally just a card with the number 17 on it. It's not a key or anything else. It's just it's a card with number 17 on it, right? And then later on, you're on card 63, and card 63 says, do you have item 17? And you go, yes, I've got item 17. And he says, great, now you can open card 64. Now, the game that we play, card 63 has a nice picture of a castle with an ancient wooden door, and card number 17 is a big old rustic key. So suddenly we need the key to open the door. But if you abstract it down to its bare parts, it is just, oh, you've gone to this place. Do you have this card? Yes, in which case turn to this one. Now take the red square, and because you've got the red square, you can now open the yellow card, but nobody would play it. If it was literally just a series of numbers and go to this and go to that, nobody would play it. You play the Time Stories game because you're enjoying the experience of playing it. You're enjoying being immersed in the setting. You're enjoying, the stories that come out of the game and everything else. But you could remove all of that and just set it to a series of numbers and colours, and it would be almost the same game, apart from the bits where you might have to spot something in a piece of artwork or something like that. So it was an interesting take on the game.
I would argue no. It wouldn't be a game anyone would play. So what's the point? If it's a game that no one would play, I would argue you can any game, any thematic game, Star Wars Rebellion. You could any of the games that we talk about as thematic, you can boil them down that way. I don't think it's particular to Time Stories. They just wouldn't be fun games anymore.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't play it.
Hey everybody, Future Jason here, getting over a cold, here in the editing room, listening back to the episode. Have you guys ever had that experience of engaging in a really good conversation, maybe something in a classroom or work setting, where you just get this urge oh, I wish I had said that. That's what I really meant to say. That happens all the time to me in interviews and the roundtables and everything, and I always try to refrain, but this time... And I am in the editing room, so nuts to you guys. If you don't like it, I'm going to get my stuff in. So what I wanted to really say in response to Paul's comment about time stories being this mechanical thing is that a thematic mechanism is like a magic trick. So games can never truly represent whatever it is, shooting a bow and arrow or opening a door with a key or whatever it is. All a game can do is present you with enough stuff to where your imagination can fill in the rest. So what I would say in response to Paul's friend who feels like time stories is not really a thematic experience is that he saw through the magic trick. He saw the hand holding the curtain and the woman walking out of the box before she gets sawed in half. Like he saw through it. It didn't work for him. However, I think it works for most people. Sales are good. They're on 9 expansions at this point, so there's your evidence there. So because it's trying to evoke that response, because it's trying to pull off the magic trick, that's what makes it a thematic mechanism, as opposed to a strategic mechanism, which is there to challenge you or to invite you to be clever or whatever that is. So I really want to do more thinking about like thematic games as attempts at magic. And I'll probably, come back to that in future episodes and develop that thought a little bit. But let me get back to the conversation. I'm about to tee off Marc and talking about Twilight Struggle, which is one of his favorite things. So back to the show. Like, Marc was mentioning Twilight Struggle. If Twilight Struggle didn't have the Cold War mechanism, like, would you play that game, Marc?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's so strong in Twilight Struggle that no matter what you transported it into, you'd be like, wow, this feels very Cold War-like. If they made a sci-fi Twilight Struggle, you'd be like, man, this is like a Cold War in space, right? I mean, I think it's so strong there, it's hard to escape.
Yeah.
But in like you mentioned Star Wars Rebellion, right? If you took away all the Star Wars characters, you probably wouldn't, and put it in some other context, you probably wouldn't necessarily think of Star Wars when you're thinking of it. But when you play it, yeah, it evokes Star Wars. It evokes the hiding of the rebellion and such. Now I haven't played Time Stories. I do know about it, so forgive me if I'm mistaken about the game. Though, isn't the thematic part of the game precisely that you are being transported to a bunch of different settings? Like, isn't the actual story of the game that you're kind of going back and forth and around in time?
Yeah, it's effectively it's Groundhog Day and Quantum Leap joined together. So where the thematic nature comes out in the mechanisms is that you have a limited amount of time units in that run because they power the time machine, whatever, and it's only got a limited amount of time that it can run for. And when that time runs out, then you get transported back to modern day and everything else, and your boss says, you're rubbish, you go back and do it again. But because of the nature of time travel, you can't just time travel to anywhere you want. You can only travel to specific points in the timeline. Therefore, when you go back, you went back, like Groundhog Day, to exactly the same start point as you were before. And you're like, right, but now we know that the dragon's through the red door. So don't go through the red door. Right, okay, so every time you play it and you go back, some people say that, the game's terrible because all you're doing is repeating exactly what you did before. I disagree with that. There are some things that you repeat, but other things you actually, each run you do, you learn. You learn what's where. So the game itself, and the reason why we like it, me and my partner, is that it's a meta puzzle game. So it's not particularly, like your escape room games, which actually have real puzzles to solve. Apart from a couple in Time Stories, and I'm saying a couple, I mean a couple across like all of the scenarios that have been published.
Right.
There is no puzzles within the game itself, but there is the meta puzzle of like, right, we've done 3 runs. We're now about to do our 4th run. Like, let's just take 10 minutes and let's work out what's where. Right, so we know that the dragon's through the red door. We don't want to go through the red door, but we now know the dragon is hiding the key to the tower. So we're going to have, if we go down there and speak to the kitchen guy, he will give us the password to get through to the jail. Then we speak to the woman. She gives us a potion of fire resistance. We drink the potion. Then we go to the dragon. We get the key and everything else. Right. And that's what the game is. The more runs you do, the more information you learn. And then you sit down and you try and work out, right, what are we going to do and where are we going to do it? And we love that kind of puzzle thing. So
Yeah.
the thematic does come across
Well,
a bit.
and it's precisely, I can think of a number, like you said, Groundhog Day. It sounds kind of like that. Even more like, what was the Tom Cruise one? Edge of Tomorrow. Is that?
Edge of Tomorrow,
Yeah,
yes.
right? Where they're just trying to solve how to defeat the aliens by looping around in time. Russian Doll on Netflix was another recent one of that thing. So, I mean, in terms of kind of capturing that Groundhog Day-ish experience, it seems like it does a decent job of it.
Yeah.
I would argue it doesn't have puzzles, but it does have mysteries, which is a kind of puzzle. And I would argue that the mechanisms of time stories can't be anything else but mystery solving and adventure. No. And it can't be anything you can't make it a race game. You can't make it a bidding game. You can't make those mechanisms a bluff, all these different things that you can do where in another, like a Euro game, like you were talking about Newton, like if you told me that game was about, gambling at a casino, it's like, okay, sure. Or about, goats eating in a very complicated way, goats eating, the maximum amount of grass on a farm.
Yeah.
Then it could do that. But in time stories, it can't do anything else besides deliver that mystery, exploration, adventure. Like maybe a couple of things, but it's genetically engineered for that, and I think that's what makes it a thematic game. And in your friend's case, it failed, so that doesn't make it a not thematic game. It just means that it just wasn't able to make the connection. It still tried, which is still a thematic game.
Well, the critiques seem to be that it's not thematic because you get transported to a number of different settings, and those play out kind of the same way. But it seems the disconnect there is that they're thinking of each individual module as needing to be thematic, when in fact it doesn't, like the theme doesn't really care about what module you're playing. The theme is about this time looping thing.
Right, correct.
Yeah. I mean, there's not many mechanisms in the game. It's just, as an action, you can move to a new location, and then sometimes you have to do skill tests to either fight monsters or pick locks or whatever, and, the rules of the game are fairly light. So there's not many, rules in there for people to sort of critique and say it's not thematic. But as I say, I get the argument, and you can boil it down to numbers and colours. But as you say, you could do that with Star Wars Rebellion. You could take the entire Star Wars Rebellion, strip off all of the artwork, and just make it a Splotter-style artwork, strip off all of the characters' names and everything else, and just have it a series of numbers and rules, and it would be exactly the same game. And anybody playing it will probably get a Star Wars feel from it, but suddenly nobody would play it. I certainly wouldn't play a game with just circles and numbers on a board and moving bits around. But yeah.
The mechanisms themselves are not a draw to the game anymore.
No.
Okay, so let's drill down to a couple of more particular angles on this. So a lot of time when people say a thematic game, what they kind of mean is a narrative game. And I'm thinking in particular of, games with a lot of flavor text. It's like I'm playing a thematic game. Oh, I don't want to play that. I don't want to have to read a bunch of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you guys had any thoughts about, thematic games, whether they need either that flavor text or need kind of a coherent narrative in order to really be thematic, or can a thematic game approach it other ways?
My opinion on flavor text is flavor text alone does not make a thematic game. It helps people to get into the setting of the game, but flavor text is one of those things that you read maybe once, maybe twice, but then you never read it again because it just slows the game down. You don't want to be reading the same flavor text every time. So I'm thinking of the flavor text on the Magic the Gathering cards. You play a fireball and it will say deal X damage to target player, right? And then below it, there's a little bit of flavor text. You might never even read that flavor text. You're certainly not going to read it really during the game. You're just going to read it when all of the cards are in your nice little, 9-pocket binders, whatever, and you'll have a look through them. But if you did read the flavor text, it's like it just tells a little bit of the backstory and the lore. So flavor text alone doesn't make a thematic game. And that also means that if a game doesn't have flavor text, that it isn't a thematic game. So one of the games which comes under some criticism for having, little flavor or theme is Mage Knight. Now, I'm slightly biased in that...
You're very biased.
It's my number one game of all time, and I designed the last two expansions for the game. But putting that aside for a minute, Mage Knight has a lot of thematic rules within the game, but the cards do not have flavor text at all. None of the cards have any flavor text. You play the card, it's called Enrage or whatever, Rage, and it says attack 2 or block 2. That's what the card says. So the cards themselves, there's no flavor built into the cards themselves, and people say, oh, it's not a very thematic game. But there are so many thematic rules in that game, which, really, really brings it out. And those thematic games allow, and this is another thing that's good, when a game is thematic and has rules which mechanically make sense, is that they're so much easier to remember. And speaking as somebody who demos games professionally at conventions, when I'm demoing a game and the rule is thematic and I'm able to explain it, I explain it and I look up at the table and they all go, ah, yeah. So when you demo in Mage Knight to people, you're like, okay, so there's a fort over here, right? There's a fort on a hill over here, and there's people inside. Now, at the moment, you're so far away, you don't know what the people are. You just know that there's a token face down on that space. Now, if you go next to that fort, so if you move to the space adjacent to the fortress, and it's daytime, you will flip the token face up because you are near the fortress and you can see the people inside, right? But if it's nighttime, you don't flip the token. That just makes total sense. Right. And people criticize the game for having these fiddly rules and exceptions upon exceptions. And it's like, well, yeah, I get that. You've got a different rule for day and night. But to me, it's just like, well, that's obvious. That makes complete sense. So you have a bunch of thematic rules in the game. And, going back to what you said about flavor text, the reason I'm mentioning it is not just because it's Mage Knight, but because Mage Knight has no flavor text on cards, but I feel is still a very thematic game.
What do you think, Mark?
I mean,
in terms of narrative and stuff.
I enjoy Mage Knight maybe only second to Paul, but I think flavor text can help quite a bit. It can help people understand, and, Paul works with CG quite a bit. CG tends to pack all their flavor text in their rule books. Yeah. I'm thinking of, especially, man, like Dungeon Lords. There's a little bit of explanation thematically for every little fiddly bit of that game. And I do love Dungeon Lords, but it certainly can be, it's a lot of rules overhead, and there's it's a lot of rules overhead, and they find something for every single rule. But even, flavor text is often associated with card games, and I think it does a decent job of getting you into what story they're trying to tell within the card game. It's done, I think, pretty well with Magic. It was done well with Netrunner. Those are the two main card games I've played. But I don't, they don't necessarily make the theme, right? The mechanisms that tie into your decision making still have to be there. The flavor text can be very good at evoking a story beyond the game. They can be good at kind of making that connection for the players. It's like, oh wow, this card actually does make sense within the idea of that character or this faction, or even if you go to like the kind of very broad color inspirations for Magic. Oh yeah, this makes sense in terms of a red card or a blue card. They can help with that, but they're more like assistants in the idea of theme rather than what makes the theme.
Yeah, I love going back to the idea of levels. I wish we could. I want to flesh that out, but in the scheme of a podcast, it might not be the most clever use of our time.
When I just thought of it over the top of the head. Don't make me do it either.
Well, like that lowest level of there are thematic elements, basically. Like, if a fireball healed you, that would not be very thematic. But a fireball or a red deck. Or a red-black deck where you're hurling fire and raising, creatures and everything, that needs to act a certain way. And if it doesn't act a certain way, then it's not going to make sense. I'm curious about this idea of Magic, though. I heard a podcast with some of the writers, because there's a lot of writers. I mean, there's tons of writers about Magic, a lot of novels, a lot of lore and everything. They get so into it, and they just consider the whole experience thematic. And how they approach it is, okay, Magic. A game of Magic doesn't have a plot where there's no story beat A, B, C, D.
I would actually disagree with that, but go on.
Okay, go ahead. Well, well, it doesn't have a spoken plot. Like if there's a plot, it emerges for the player. So like, I drew this, and that means I was able to counter this and everything. That's it. It emerges. It wasn't baked into the game. I contrast that to a game like Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, which I don't know if you guys played, but that game had a lot of plot. Like, you do this, and then you read this card, and then it tells you to do this. And then you read this card, and then you kind of shooting through. And that was that game's approach to, like, plot and narrative and immersion and theme and all that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering if you would, like, okay, actually, what are your thoughts in terms of, like, Magic being a thematic game, quote unquote?
I mean, I think every game of Magic has a cadence to it, and that is what drives the narrative, right? If you're a super control deck against or if you're playing a really fast red deck maybe, and you're against a control deck, right? The plot of that is that are you able to race out enough damage in time before they can get a foothold in their control magic? And you can imagine that in terms of two spellcasters out on the field or whatever, but that's a bit of a narrative. It's not super strong, but it's somewhat of a narrative. Netrunner,
You have to hook you. It's just a hook.
It's a cadence, right? It's a flow to this very small story of that game. Netrunner did it a bit better. There's a lot more Magic tends to snowball. Netrunner had some very subtle catch-up mechanisms that made the story of any individual game a bit more multi-layered. But think about a game like Spirit Island, which I think is remarkably thematic. The theme is almost entirely in the cadence of it, which is that you're getting beat down and you push back, but at the same time you grow stronger and stronger until towards the end of the game you're able to unleash very strong attacks or very strong abilities. I don't think that cadence should be understated. Like that's very important to the feeling of that game, the feeling of growing stronger and being able to influence the board more and push back harder than you did before. And I think you get a bit of that in Magic and a lot of games of that nature, right? A lot of those kind of combat card games, even if they're cooperative like Spirit Island. It's a little bit harder to define, but I mean, the same thing in Mage Knight, certainly, right? The sense of progression and growing and encountering particularly tough obstacles and overcoming them, getting set back with some wounds in hand and having to recover from that, go to a glade and heal for a turn or two. That to me is narrative, right? It doesn't have to be an actual specific story. It's the feeling of, well, I had to overcome this, but I took some damage and now I rest a bit. That's a story in and of itself. And I think we shouldn't necessarily gloss over that. That can play into a lot of different games.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's, and I've heard the same thing about Mage Knight is there's two ways you can play Mage Knight. You can play Mage Knight and you can say, right, I'm taking on the city. I've got these 4 enemies. I've got these 7 cards in hand. I've got these crystals. I've got these units. How am I going to do this? You spend 5 minutes working out the puzzle. You play the cards, you do the thing, and you do the best you can. And then, as you say, you're full of wounds and you need to go on to the next city, so you decide to spend a turn going to the healing glade and you lose some of your wounds and you do all that. There's no flavour text in the game. There's no narrative given to you in the game. There's no story to read. There's no anything. But it's telling a story, and you can tell that story yourself if you want to. Now, it's interesting what you said about Magic the Gathering, because it's the same thing applies. Now, in the late 90s, for those who don't know, Magic the Gathering was my entire life. I didn't do any other hobbies whatsoever. I was a DCI level 3 judge. I played at national championships. I was a relatively good player, and I played like constantly. I have never once in all my hundreds and hundreds of games of Magic the Gathering felt that I was a wizard casting spells. And I would go out on a limb and say almost everybody who I played with at no point actually felt that they were a wizard casting spells, or that any duel between them and another player was telling any kind of story at all. But since Mark has just mentioned it, I'm like, oh yeah, you could sit there and you could actually say, oh right, yeah, I am a spellcaster and I am here, and oh, you've summoned a boar, right? There's a boar there. I need to deal with it. I'm going to zap it with a firebolt or what? And that a game, I guess, does tell a story. But you have to provide that story yourself.
Well, I mean, with any game, you get to a certain level of competitiveness, and it kind of strips away everything else, regardless of the game, right?
Yeah, you just go red car 3 damage. You know, you're not seeing that it's a fireball anymore. You just play a card, deal 3 damage. That's that gone. You just see the numbers.
Right.
It's like the Matrix. You know, you're not seeing anything outside of that.
I think what you were saying before, though, I guess in a different way, but I think it's operating kind of on an unconscious level, the theme, where, like, if I see a red card, then all of a sudden my mind space is in, okay, I can do some damage with this thing. I don't have to read the number, and it's operating kind of on that underlying assumption level of red card equals fire, equals damage. You know, I didn't need to read a rule for that, like you were mentioning before about how you were at a table and you didn't need to explain certain things, or when you did, you say like, okay, makes sense. Like, it makes sense that a fireball does what it does. It makes sense that a black card that, I can get cards out of my discard pile, which is raising the dead, so to speak. You know, like if Magic didn't care about that stuff, it wouldn't be successful, if that makes sense.
I mean, there's a big difference between, I have played a card on you, Jason, right? And it's dealt you 4 damage, and I'm now going to put a counter on your character sheet. And you say, well, what does that counter do? And I say, right, that counter on your character sheet means you take 1 damage at the start of each of your turns. And you go, okay, right. Now, same situation, but I'm going to call that counter a burn counter. And all of a sudden, I then say, right, so I'm going to put this burn counter on your character. This represents that your character is now on fire, and therefore, at the start of each of your turns, you're going to take 1 damage until you spend an action to remove that counter, which represents putting out the flames. Right. Suddenly I've provided theme to the mechanic and everybody understands it. You see the burn counter and you now think, oh yeah, my character's on fire, but if I spend time and it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same rule, but I've called it a burn counter and I've thematically explained what that action is for you to remove that counter. So yeah, there's theme there in games, even if it's not printed in the rulebook and even if it's not printed in flavor text, there are a lot of thematic explanations to the rules. But yeah, it does help when they give you that information rather than you having to work it out yourself.
Please take note, Fantasy Flight. I did not like Arkham 3rd Edition just because it forced plot. And I didn't, it's the same reason I don't like Mansions of Madness, which is a thematic game, and people kind of point to it and say they enjoy it. I feel like the game is playing me. It's telling me what experiences to have, and if it's giving me a choice, the choice is often binary, often illusory. So like the same choice results in the same, different choices result in the same effect. And I don't feel like I'm playing. As flawed as Arkham 2nd Edition was, I'd rather play that because at least I feel like I'm an agent in the story. You know.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because last week I actually was the guest on another podcast, which I don't think is out yet, and the subject of conversation was Mansions of Madness, 2nd edition, because I absolutely detest the game, and the podcast host absolutely loves the game. And we were having a conversation on Twitter, and I'm friends with him anyway, and he said, I'm going to get you on the podcast, and we're going to talk purely about this one game. And what I'm not going to cover here what we covered in that podcast, but I felt Mansions of Madness 2nd edition had 0 meaningful player decisions.
Right. Because
it's all driven by the app. You choose to fight the monster and it's like, so what do you want to fight the monster with? Do you want to fight it with a knife or a club? By the way, the monster's, more vulnerable to edged weapons. Okay? So I'll use the knife then? Yeah, good choice. And then you press a button, you press a button and a random number generator decides what happens.
Yeah, I haven't played those games, but I've played Eldritch Horror and it sounds very similar.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, moving on from that, Arkham Horror, the card game, is soon becoming in my top 5 games of all time.
Man, I have that in shrink on my shelf, and I just got to pull it out and play it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are a couple of mechanisms within the game which are big no-nos for me. And if those mechanisms were in a Euro game, I would not play it because of the mechanisms in there. Which is effectively the sort of, it's a roll to resolve. You're drawing a token out of a bag. It's effectively the same as rolling to resolve. And with the Arkham Horror card game, you have to commit cards to the skill test before you draw the token out of the bag. And it could be that you committed cards that you didn't need because you drew a positive token, or you commit all the cards in the world and then you draw the auto-fail token. If that was in a Euro game, I would not play that game at all. But the Arkham Horror card game is so amazing and so fantastic on so many other levels The fact that it has these mechanisms in there which are normally big turn-offs for me, I can forgive it for that and move on. And the reason why I'm mentioning the Arkham Horror card game is not just because it's one of my favourite games right now and I'm loving it. Thematically, the rules are incredible. Mm-hmm. And you read a keyword and it says, right, what's the keyword? Massive. Right, what does massive mean? Massive means the creature never engages with an individual player, right? It's considered to be engaged with all players at the same location as it all the time. Okay, I can see that because it's massive, right? Also, if you attack a massive enemy that is engaged with another player, the normal rules are if you miss that enemy, you hit the player. So in other words, if you're fighting a ghoul and I decide to shoot the ghoul and I miss the ghoul, I hit you, which is a thematic rule. That rule doesn't apply with massive enemies. And you go, oh yeah, because it's massive. So, and the Arkham Horror card game has a lot of rules and a lot of keywords, and every single keyword is like, that makes sense, and it's just brilliant. I mean, I love it for various reasons, but one of the reasons I love it is thematically, all of the mechanisms just seem to work so well together. Yeah.
If it wasn't Arkham Horror, and if it wasn't so expensive, it would be one of my top 5 games.
Okay. Well, this is the thing. I've been borrowing a friend's copy for a year.
Everything about that game is so good, so thematic, like you were saying before. And I think actually I'll use this to transition to the last kind of topic over here. I guess the role to resolve, so to speak. Yeah. A lot of what people think of thematic games are the quote unquote Ameritrashy games of dice rolling, and so they counter that to the Euro game, which is has more deterministic resolutions, all that kind of stuff. So what do you guys think? And I'll go to Mark first. What do you guys think of like that Ameritrashy? Like an Ameritrash game is a thematic game, and dice resolution is kind of baked into a lot of people's ideas of what a thematic game is.
I think I'll say 2 things. One, I think it depends on the game, right? Dice resolution can be kind of thematic in certain contexts. In other words, in contexts where it makes sense that you all of a sudden lose a lot of agency and are kind of throwing things out to some chance. So it's used a lot in war games, and I think it works fairly well in war games, right? A general of an army can do as much planning as he wants, but there's a lot of elements outside of his control once the battle actually begins, right? In that sense, maybe it's not necessarily the best design feature from a gameplay perspective to make things interesting, but it's somewhat thematic. If you're playing Eldritch Horror and you pull up a random card and then it's just an enemy you can't beat, I mean, it's a bit thematic, I suppose, that you encountered something unexpected, but it doesn't feel the same way. I actually just also wrote an article a few weeks ago on this question of, in terms of games where especially fantasy games, where you're trying to defeat something in the end. So I talked about Mage Knight, I talked about Spirit Island, and I brought in Descent. Games like that, the dice rolling doesn't work there at all, I think. And I think it's kind of something that designers have relied on because D&D did it. And D&D, if you look back, is actually a spin-off from a war game at first.
Chainmail.
Chainmail. So I think it kind of borrowed that, and I think it's not particularly great from a design perspective. And it's precisely because in those kind of fantasy narratives, if you look at literature, if you look anything where you're looking at a fantasy genre, it's almost always about overcoming obstacles. And rolling dice and kind of taking things outside of the control of the player is the opposite of that. And why I think Mage Knight works so well and Spirit Island works so well and Descent doesn't really, is because when you defeat a city in Mage Knight or a particularly difficult turn in Spirit Island, you have made a lot of good decisions to overcome what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, which is precisely what fantasy as a genre is about, right? As a literary genre, it's almost always about
Yep.
overcoming, it's about defeating the dragon. It's about saving your homeland against the hordes of enemies, right? It's about that. So in those kinds of games, dice rolling as a resolution mechanism kind of throws it all out the window. But if you're looking at a big strategic war game where you're looking at ideas of hubris and generals sending, giant thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands of soldiers into battle, yeah, throw some randomness in there because they don't have control over that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's the reason why I stopped playing Descent in the end, is I just got fed up with, you do all of this and you spend a couple of minutes planning and, you move over there and then I'll do this and you do that and then you roll and miss. Oh, well, that we're all completely
Yeah.
screwed. And it's like, and it's just, it was frustrating to the point where it was just, and the thing is I play Gloomhaven, and Gloomhaven has the card in there that is effectively a miss. And Arkham Horror has the tentacle in the bag, which is an auto fail. So I think basically it depends what mood I'm in. Whereas in Mage Knight, as you say, when you take on that big city at the end and you spend 10 minutes working out your turn and what you can do, and if you do it, you've done it because of you, and you've done it because of your hand management that you've taken over the entire day, the decisions you've made, the cards that you've picked up, all of those little decisions all come together at once, and then you're like, right, and same with Spirit Island, where you absolutely love, when you win Spirit Island, you feel that you've won because of the decisions you've made. Yes, there's a bit of a random factor in there, but there's no random element in the combat. If the card says it deals 3 damage to, the invaders, it deals 3 damage to the invaders. It's not dice rolling. But going back to what you said about the whole Ameritrash versus Euro, this is another discussion that could be an hour's podcast just on its own. A lot of people don't like the term Ameritrash and believe that it's a derogatory term and you should stop using it. And I know a number of people who I class as friends who say that these definitions of Euro and Ameritrash are outdated and we should stop using them, which I totally disagree with. For me, they're useful. Now, I think the scale of whether a game is thematic or not is a completely different scale to the Euro and Ameritrash. So Euro and Ameritrash is one scale. And for me, the Euro game is very low random element, very little player interaction, no player conflict, no player elimination, all of that stuff. And your Ameritrash is dice for resolution, lots of player conflict, lots of player interaction, and that kind of thing. Now, it is true that more Ameritrash games are thematic than Euro games, but whether a game is thematic or not is a completely different scale. So the term Ameritrash and thematic, I think, they shouldn't be, they're not synonyms of each other. You can have a thematic Euro. They're rarer, but you can have a thematic Euro. So yeah, I think they're different scales.
So let me take a step back and just focus on the dice. I'm actually, for the first time in this podcast, I'm going to disagree. It's been a big agree fest,
we'll
but I'm
edit
actually
this
going
bit out,
to...
though, yeah? The bit where you disagree, you'll edit that bit out. So it's just me and Mark, yeah? Cool.
I wanted to go to Mark's point about how dice in certain circumstances are thematic and other circumstances no. I would argue that dice in D&D are a very thematic experience. I mean, I get the idea about agency, right, and overcoming obstacles, but it's not like you're only at the mercy of the dice. Like, I mean, you have entire adventures where you have to gather, +1 swords, or a +3 sword of the Phoenix or whatever it is. And you get, in the more recent iterations of D&D, you get combat advantage. Like, you get all these ways of mitigating the dice to kind of leverage things in your favor. But then the game is telling you, okay, even if you have all that stuff going on, you still might not be able to make happen what you want to make happen, which is the essence of adventure. It isn't an adventure without that sense of the unknown. And what the dice do is it introduces that unknown element, and it also introduces that tense, exciting element, which I would say, if you're going to tell a good story, you need that. If I did a bunch of stuff and I could just do, I load the cannon, I fire it, and then the thing falls off, that's not a good story. But if I did everything I could do and then I failed, and then, and I got in that position and I succeeded or whatever it is, then that's a good story. And that's theme to me. So I would definitely say like a pure dice roll, not really. If you keep on pulling like no, not really. But just the way the number distribution works over the long term, I think dice are an excellent kind of generator of an excellent story.
I think they work okay in D&D, and I think it's precisely because, and I love D&D. I wish I could play it more. And I think it's precisely because everything else in the game is working to mitigate or kind of work around extreme dice rolls, right? So in a board game, if you rolled a crit fail over and over and over again, you're just going to lose. Like your players are going to die and you're going to lose. Or whatever the parallel for a critical fail is in that game, right? In D&D, though, it can become an entirely new adventure from that kind of situation just through the skill of the DM. So it has a lot of ways to counter what would be a design failure in a different game.
Yeah, I mean, what you said about, and I think you've sort of explained why I like the Arkham horror game, even though it effectively has roll to resolve, is it's exciting. It's exciting and it's the unknown. And, in a Euro game, I want to know that if I spend 2 time units in the forest, I get 3 cubes. I want to know that because it's probably a resource management game. I don't want to spend 2 time units and then roll a dice where a 1 is you get eaten by zombies and you're dead, and a 6 is you find every single tree in the forest and it's automatically cut down. I don't want that level of swingy randomness in a Euro game, but in a storytelling narrative adventure game, possibly I do. Yeah. I mean, what you said about dice rolling being exciting, and going back right to the start of the podcast, let's talk about Dice Tower. One of my favourite games, which I love as a game, and I think is extremely thematic, is Flamme Rouge, bicycle racing game. The mechanisms are just perfect. It's like, oh yeah, this, not that I'm an expert on bicycle racing or the Tour de France, but it's like, oh yeah, this is probably how it would actually be. Your riders get tired as the game goes on. If you're at the front of the pack, you get the wind resistance, so you get more tired, and it's all there. And the Dice Tower hated it because they felt it was totally boring and there was no excitement whatsoever. And what they wanted is they wanted dice. They wanted like Formula D, where you roll dice to see how many spaces you move. And I totally get that you're sat there and you're shaking the dice in your hand and you're like, oh, what's it going to be? What's it going to be? And you roll and you're 5. Hey, it's a 5, right? And that has excitement for you and the other players and everything else. And they felt that the decision of which cards you play and then revealing your cards and then moving that number of spaces on the board was not exciting and completely and utterly boring. And maybe because me and my group generally prefer Euro games, but Flamme Rouge is one of the most tense, exciting games that I've ever played, because you're looking at the other players and you're like, oh, what's he going to play? Oh, I don't know. And then you put your own cards down and you're like, okay, right, everybody reveal the cards. Oh, you went a 6. Oh, I went a 4. Oh, no, that means I'm going to be able to slipstream you. That tension, that excitement is completely there for us in Flamme Rouge, which it wasn't there for Dice Tower, which was an interesting observation, is that, normally the dice rolling is the variable randomness excitement. We got exactly the same feeling, even though we were choosing what cards we played. It was interesting.
So that goes to, I guess, the last question I wanted to ask you guys while I had you, was just Euro games in general. And going to you, Mark, and I know you just threw this out immediately, but I'm just going to think about this forever now. the different levels of theme, how that highest level of theme is you are a character in the world of the game making decisions as if you were, a person there. Can a Euro game do that, like a real Euro game? Anything from Castles of Burgundy to Newton we were talking about before. Like, do you feel like a Euro game can actually get there, or is the best the Euro game can hope for are those kind of thematic elements, but you're still kind of at the end of the day strategizing?
I mean, that question kind of depends on your definition of Euro game, but I'm not going to get into that. I certainly think it can. I'm looking through a list of games. I played a game, was it last week at PAX East Pipeline, which hasn't been fully released yet. It was on Kickstarter. That's a hardcore Euro game, but man, I think it's incredibly thematic in a very interesting way. It's a buy low, sell high kind of game, not on a stock market, but you're refining oil. So you want to buy cheaper oil, refine it, and then sell it at a higher price. And it is, I think, impressively thematic in unusual ways, in ways I haven't seen before. I won't go into a lot of detail, but there are two things I wanted to highlight. All across the game, there's, in almost every kind of action and everything you're trying to do, there's always two paths you can take. One costs money but doesn't spend actions, and the other one spends actions but doesn't cost as much money or doesn't cost any money. So you're constantly kind of fighting between whether or not you want to expend some liquid cash in order to save on manpower and time, which I think is thematic in the idea of building a business and trying to get ahead in a competitive marketplace. It's thematic in a very subtle way, but I think it's thematic, substantially thematic. The other thing is with Pipeline is that you're building this network of pipes off to the side through these tiles you get throughout the game. And the network of pipes determines how well you can refine the oil. So there are three colors of pipe. So there's orange, white, and teal. And you're trying to connect similar colors into a long chain. And the longer the pipe chain, the better you're able to refine the oil, which on first glance doesn't seem thematic at all. It seems really arbitrary. But when I thought about it, I'm like, if I was building a business and wanted to outpace my competitors and wanted to be best at a particular thing, in this case, refining oil, what kind of skills would I need? Well, I need foresight. I would need the ability to overcome, to puzzle out difficult situations. I would need to be able to plan very well. And all of that is encapsulated in this very tangential little mini game you're playing with, spatially trying to construct these pipes. And I don't know, I think that's really, that was interestingly thematic in a way I hadn't seen before. More obvious examples of Euro games that I think are super thematic. Brass, I think, is fairly thematic with the way it works with markets. Food chain magnate, in its very bizarro world. If you buy into that bizarro, the super weird logic of its world, it becomes quite thematic. What else we have here? The Gallerist, you mentioned before, I think is fairly thematic. Yeah. The worker placement aspect of it isn't, which is kind of the fundamental drive of the game. But again, it's another buy low, sell high thing. So I think there are a number of Euro games that are certainly thematic just because they tap into the kind of predicaments and, again, decision making that their setting has. And often it's a market thing, right? It's building up a business or something similar to that in a market, in a dynamic market. But that's what Euro games do well. That's the primary source of non-conflict competition we have in the world, so it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? I think I know what you're going to say to that, Paul. Like whether a Euro game can truly reach that highest level of thematic immersion. But go ahead. What do you think? Can a Euro do that?
A Euro game can absolutely be an extremely thematic game. It can be. It just, and the game that I designed 1 hour and 10 minutes ago, where I spend 3 time units and I go and chop the trees down and then pay Alan to drive the wood back to my thing, and then I pay Frank to turn those planks of wood into a chair, and then all of that lot. That is a pure Euro game. I'm not going to have any random element in there. There's no player interaction. There's no conflict. There's no nothing else. But every single rule of that game that I've just made up is a thematic rule. So that whole game is extremely thematic. It sounds like the most boring game ever, but a lot of games, and there's me and my friends playing a Euro game, and we're really excited about it, and we're absolutely loving it. And people come over who like your Ameritrash style games are staring at a board covered in cubes and are like, what are you finding enjoyable about this? And it's like, well, do I move 2 cubes to there or 1? And they're like, seriously? And they walk away in disgust. But, if you're a Eurogame fan, you're agonising about these decisions because you know that it's going to have an impact. And it's going to, mean something later on.
That actually taps into something I wanted to mention earlier, which I think could kind of well, let me know if you guys agree with this as kind of a broad point, that oftentimes theme is spoken of in this kind of external sense of, do I get an impression of the game by looking at it, or do I get a sense of narrative by looking at it? Whereas we're defining theme more in line with the internal state of the players playing the game, regardless of the external visual aspect that you see when you walk by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't mentioned that, and it is an important point. Because it really, you know, the artwork and everything else really does add to the, you know, the overall experience and the atmosphere of playing the game.
Yeah, I think like in terms of a definition, and I think we can kind of come to a summary point here, although I do have one more thing to say, but I'll throw it at the end. Defining what a thematic game is, I think we can kind of say as a catch-all, like, you know, a set of mechanisms and other game elements, you know, so the presentation, the art, the sculpts, if it's a minis game, that make sense with whatever the underlying world is, and that evoke that for the players. You know, so I think just in terms of a very kind of, well, a kind of a messy, but has all the elements of what we're looking for when it comes to theme. Like, I think that integration of theme mechanisms and art and all the other stuff is what makes for a thematic game. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't personally put as much emphasis on the art. I think it's you know, 99% down to the mechanisms within the game. I'm just saying the art helps with the immersion. If it's good art that fits the setting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One thing I did want to say, so I almost agree with you guys in terms of like Euro games being thematic. The one difficulty I have, and it's a huge one for me, any game that has victory points just breaks the spell. Like it just breaks the spell. Like immersion, like, you know, theme is a spell. It's a trick. It's immersing you in its world. So you can describe all these things that I'm doing. I'm paying Alan to do this, or I'm, you know, fitting these pipes and everything. And then I move my cube up a score track.
Right.
And like, so I can get into all this stuff, but I can't like make this, like I can't do anything. I have, you know, if I want to play well at the game, I have to make the decision that will allow me to push this cube up the score track. And I can't think of any other situation in life that's analogous to like a score track. Like I don't, you know, unless it's like the most dreary, you know, work situation where everybody kind of gets a score from work, which is kind of stupid. I wouldn't want to work.
Well, let me ask you this, Jason.
Good.
When you have some good quality time with your kids and you're playing with them, do you get a sense of satisfaction, a good feeling?
Absolutely.
Right? That's what victory points do in games, if they're done well, right?
Yeah.
They just abstract whatever your character's values are, right, to something quantifiable. And so a game that's good will do that in interesting and clever ways, or a game that utilizes victory points well, right? They'll say, okay, these are the values that we need to incentivize the players toward, and we'll represent those with victory points because that's the most direct incentive. I'm thinking, because Paul's on here, I keep thinking of CGE games, but I think Alchemist does that incredibly well. Where it incentivizes kind of loony behaviors in its attempt to kind of satirize academia. And the victory points have a very important role to play to push the players towards risky behavior, right? Because they want to get ahead of the other players in publishing their theories and whatnot. But it's just representative of the values that these crazy wizard academics have in the game, in the story of the game.
Yeah, I mean, some Euros don't bother explaining it, and they just go, if you do this, you get 3 points. And they even call them victory points, a lot of Euro games.
Right.
But you'll find other games will use, like, it's prestige points. And, you know, in the opening flavor text of the game, it will say, you're all rich nobles in medieval France, and you're all trying to, you know, use or influence points, or you're trying to do stuff, and basically you're trying to get renown and become the best known family in southern France, and you will do this by having fancy houses and having a nice garden, and this is all represented in the game by prestige points. Straight away you have a thematic connection, so that you know at the end of the game, if you've got, you know, 73 prestige points and you've only got 43, it means my family is more well known because I've got a shinier crown, or I've got nice flowers growing in my garden.
Or look at like Suburbia, right? It's population, but it's just victory points, right? Yeah,
it is. Yeah. So as I say, some Euro games you can just go, whatever, it's points, and there is no thematic reason for the points is that, going back again to Castles of Burgundy, I have just completed an area that was 4 hexes, which gets me 10 points. Why do I get 10 points? Because it's 4 hexes. And I refer back to what I said at the start. There's no theme in Castles of Burgundy. It's purely a mechanisms game. The bigger the area is, the more points I get. There's no thematic reason for that whatsoever. So I think the points in that game, although they've probably called the points something else, but that doesn't fit. Whereas going back to my made-up game about being noble French family, he's like, well, if I just buy this new estate and spend 5,000 francs to have it renovated with gold lint all over the front door, that gets me 3 prestige points. I can relate to that, because suddenly it's like, oh, that Grogan family, oh yeah, well, they've got a new golden front door, oh, look at them. It kind of fits. Whereas if it's just, for me, I like Eurogames, so I don't mind that it's points. I don't need the game to explain what the points represent. I just know I need to have more of them than the players at the end.
I guess my thing is, I'm not saying it's anti-theme. I just feel like it doesn't rise to the level of like being truly immersive. So like you mentioned before, I'm enjoying time with my kid, and the point is kind of measuring that. Well, I'm not having more fun than that other parent who's having fun with their kid. Like I'm not racing ahead in enjoyment.
It's certainly an imperfect way, but it's oftentimes kind of the best way you can get to quantifying unquantifiable things in a game.
I guess what I'm saying is, and I completely agree with that. Like I think that there's a place for strategy games, there's a place for victory points, and it does a lot of great stuff. I guess in terms of when I evaluate what games I find the most thematic, it would be either like a cooperative game where it's me versus the game, or a competitive game where it's like me versus the other, where the victory condition is I've defeated you. I can imagine that. That's a direct thing. Like I can defeat you. Like if we get into a fight, which I hope we never do. That'd be but if we do fight and I defeat you, then I can represent that whether it's in real life or a game. But if I have a prettier dress than you or a prettier tuxedo than you or whatever I'm doing, and I've represented it by points, it just feels like it creates a thematic break that just, I don't know, man. I just don't think that Euros could ever rise to that level, but it sounds like you guys disagree, which is fine.
I think the examples where victory points are done really thematically and well are few. Another example that just came to mind where a designer did the complete opposite. They took what would normally be victory points and made it something else, is Knizia in The Quest for El Dorado, right? It takes the idea of deck building, where you're kind of racing to a threshold of victory points, but then makes those victory points literally movement on a map, which I thought was interesting. I don't have any larger point. I just thought that was a super interesting design decision.
Okay, so, this was a very wide-ranging conversation. As both of you have emphasized, we could probably drill down on 3 or 4 of these kind of subtopics and make them their own podcast, but I think we're okay for now. I think this is a good start. Let everybody know where we can contact you guys on Twitter, so in case we want to continue some of these conversations. Twitter, Facebook, all that kind of stuff.
Well, I'm Gaming Rules Vids on Twitter, or Gaming Rules Videos on Facebook, because that was too many characters for Twitter, so I had to lose some at the end. I tend not to prefer to have these sorts of discussions on social media, just because there isn't enough space. But catch me at any big convention, and I am more than happy to go on and on and on and on about it and discuss this to the nth degree over an ice cream. I'll be at Origins, Essen, Gen Con, UK Games Expo, and a number of other conventions. But yeah, I'm more than happy to have these sorts of discussions, because whilst I may have come across as all sort of high and mighty and this is how it is and this is my opinion, this didn't used to be my opinion, right? My opinion is as it is right now, and that is because of discussions like this that I have had with people like you two over the last few years, which has moulded my decision. It's opened my eyes. It's allowed me to sort of, see more sides of the story, and I will now be saying to everybody that Twilight Struggle is a thematic game.
Mission accomplished.
Because Marc has convinced me, and it's when you explained it, I was like, yeah, you're absolutely right, and
Magic the Gathering as well.
Maybe not Magic the Gathering. I'm still trying to reduce your life total from 20 to 0. That's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
What about you, Marc? What are some of the best places to reach you?
If you look up The Thoughtful Gamer, and you should be able to find me on Twitter. I'm MarcTTG, spelled MarcTTG. But yeah, just look up The Thoughtful Gamer. Contact me however you want. I should respond. But I'm on Twitter, Facebook. It's probably not too hard to find my email address somewhere if you want to email, but the Thoughtful Gamer is where you'll find me.
And you both run Patreons. I wanted to put that
Yes.
out there. Please support these two fine gentlemen. They do work very hard to put out content. Marc puts out very, very thoughtful content. I'm always very excited to, when he has a perspective on something, when his little desk side chats. I look forward to those podcasts a lot. You don't have enough of those, though.
I need to get back into it. It's been a chaotic time in life. My wife and I just bought a house, so we were in the house buying process. Now we're in the house updating process.
Absolutely. And Paul, we basically, when I said before about a gaming empire, it really is. I mean, publishers know to reach out for him for top of the line rules editing, rules videos and everything, and as well as the editing part of it, and also the podcast as well with interviews and some discussion and everything. So please support these two gentlemen on their Patreons. I'm still working on mine. Maybe I'll get a Patreon sometime this year. Who the heck knows?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with mine, I try to keep the line, because the rule book writing and the instructional videos, they are commissioned pieces of work. I mean, there's no way I'm going to spend 30 or 40 hours or even more sometimes on creating a single video or writing a rulebook. That is my day job. That is what I do. Gaming rules is a full-time gig for me. There's a lot of stuff I do which is not commissioned at all by any publisher, which is the reviews and the podcast and everything else. And that's what my Patreon does. That the Patreon supports. It allows me to basically take 10 days a month off my paid work, and I do the other work as well, which I financially I wouldn't be able to do without the Patreon. But I do try and keep the line. I say to people, if you're going to support me on Patreon, don't support me on Patreon because of my rules videos. Support me to do the other stuff. That's what I say. There's plenty of people that support me for my rules videos, and they just want to contribute to the show anyway, which is absolutely fine. I don't mind that.
All right, so before we sign off, we have one last little nugget. We've mentioned many, many thematic games throughout the course of this podcast. To reiterate, we got Star Wars Rebellion, Arkham Horror, LCG especially. Some of the other ones have difficulties, but I think the LCG is just prime thematic stuff. We've mentioned Time Stories, Marc Davis, Twilight Struggle, and Paul, obviously, Mage Knight, being a big one. Let's end with maybe one or two thematic games that we haven't mentioned that maybe the listeners can kind of take a look at as examples of thematic gaming.
Well, I was going to mention Flamme Rouge, but I've already mentioned that. So yeah, Flamme Rouge is a very thematic game. I'm trying to think of other ones that I haven't already mentioned. Okay. Come back to me in a minute. See if Mark's got one.
I'm scrolling through my list. Hold on.
Because I was going to mention Spirit Island if nobody else did, but that's been mentioned as well. So yeah,
I have two, so you guys can think a little bit.
Okay.
Burgle Brothers, which
yes.
I think it takes that kind of Forbidden Desert-esque engine, which is that's an abstract game.
Yeah.
But it takes that and puts in enough of the tension and the random adventure elements where I think it really kind of immerses you in that kind of heist feel in a very effective way. And also Freedom the Underground Railroad, which is a difficult theme of a game. I mean, not everybody's going to enjoy that. I mean, you're basically an abolitionist and you're helping runaway slaves escape to Canada, which, that's a very difficult thing for people to get into. And mechanism-wise, it can be a little bit mechanical because the slaves, which are cubes, they kind of respond to the slave catchers, and it's a kind of one-to-one mechanism, push-pull type of thing, so it can feel a little bit rough. But for the most part, there's enough thematic elements there where I can really get into it and feel really happy when I win, which I hope I win that game. That's one of those games I really feel bad when I lose.
Yeah, I mean, I've not played that game, but I have friends that have played it, and I'm keen to play it, and they've said it is an extremely thematic game. And as you say, you've got a lot of rules in there, but if the rules make sense, and if the rules are like, oh yeah, that's how it would work if this was real life kind of thing, then yeah, it's a thematic game.
Right. So, I mean, you don't have to. We mentioned a lot of games.
All right.
I know I put you.
I found three.
There you go.
Robinson Crusoe, I think, works really well. Taking push your luck in a survival game, which makes perfect sense, and kind of expanding on that. I would also mention the coin games, not necessarily because they do a good amount of work for kind of historic simulation, but it's really about the interpersonal simulation between the different players in whatever conflict they're looking at that stands out remarkably. And then finally, I go back and forth on Fog of Love and how thematic it actually is, but I think it's an interesting test case, or it's an interesting example to look at in taking the prisoner's dilemma and applying it to relationships, which I don't know. I'll leave it at there. I don't know how well it succeeds on a thematic level, but it's certainly interesting.
Okay, you got one, Paul, or did we stump you?
No. I think you've stumped me. I mean, I can say, as Mark mentioned earlier on, I do a lot of work with CGE, and one of the reasons why I love Larger's games is that so many of his rules are thematically explained. The way that everything works in the game is like, oh yeah, that makes sense, and that makes sense. He tends to do, apart from in recent years, he tends to do fairly meaty, heavy games, like your Dungeon Lords and your Dungeon Pets. But everything works the way you think it should work. I do a lot of work with Vital Lacerda as well, and a lot of Vital Lacerda's games are heavy, complex, full of mechanisms. When you speak to Vital, especially a game like Lisboa,
I almost mentioned Lisboa.
Yeah, and you're like, well, this game doesn't really have any theme. All I'm doing is I'm just doing this and I'm moving a cube here. And then you speak to Vital and he explains to you the historical significance of what all of this means. And you're like, oh my God. So, and unfortunately, there wasn't room in the rulebook to put all of that in there.
Yeah.
But in the game, you just think, oh, I've got to pay this and I've got to add that number that's over there. And I've also got to add 3 if there's a red cube here. And you just do it. And then when he explains what actually happened in 1755 and the years afterwards and what the Marquis and the decisions that he made and why that's there, you're like, oh my God, this is one of the most thematic games out there in the way that it is all set. And right now, I am living and breathing On Mars. I mean, this is why I only slept for 3 hours last night, is I'm working on the rulebook for On Mars. I've taught it twice in the last week. I'm doing the official rules video next week. So I'm absolutely living and breathing this game. And there is so much thematic explanation for a lot of the rules in this game that I'm really enjoying teaching it to people. Because again, I have that experience. If I teach them the rule, I say it, I explain why the rule is like that, and they all nod, and suddenly they get it. And it's really nice. It's really nice.
I can't wait to play that game. I'm doing a whole month dedicated to Lacerda next month.
Ooh,
I'm hoping to get
right.
Hopefully, because Escape Plan is actually shipped out, right?
Escape Plan is being delivered to people right now. I am seeing pictures on social media of Escape Plan arriving in various people's hands, which is great.
Can't wait.
Yeah, and Escape Plan's got a lot of thematic rules in there as well. Have you played Escape Plan? Did you have a chance to play it in prototype form?
No. As a kind of general rule, I try to stay away from prototypes just because of time.
Right.
But I'm excited to play. I just came across another very thematic game, the Exceed system from Brad Telton at level 99.
Yes. The fighting game.
Yeah, basically just ports a fighting game to a card game, and it works perfectly.
Okay.
All right, Marc Davis, you are the thoughtful gamer. Paul Grogan is from Gaming Rules. Thank you so much, gentlemen. This was so much fun.
This was a blast. I loved it.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'll do this anytime.